Okay, so today we're going to be talking about loudness, compression, etc. So first we need to talk about the volume trap. So basically, to most people and most ears, including most mix engineers, louder sounds better, subjectively speaking. If you crank up something by 0.5 dB, doesn't matter if you've actually changed anything in the music or the mixing or whatever, it's going to sound better. So a lot of plugins, their presets are constructed on this basis, and often they'll bump up the output decibels by 1 or 2 dB, which is of course very misleading. And you can end up with compression and limiting and all sorts of things where the output signal actually sounds worse than the incoming signal, but you're fooled into thinking that it sounds better because it was slightly louder. And this is a big problem in the digital domain. When we were back in analog, there were hard physical limits as to how far you could push things before, in terms of volume and compression and whatnot, before things started to distort on tape and would, make the needle jump on the record and this sort of thing. That's why records tend to have much nicer masters than CDs or digital do nowadays, because you simply can't have the same amount of average loudness on a record as you can in a digital medium. So often you get these really nice mixes going to the record that do not end up on the CD, etc. If you want an example of that, you can Google Doom 2016 audiophile edition on YouTube. That's basically just the record version of the Doom 2016 soundtrack, and you'll hear immediately that it's got much nicer dynamics, it's a much stronger mix because it hasn't been brick-walled all to heck. Second thing we need to go into a little bit is the loudness wars. So adding to that psychological effect of louder is better, in the 90s, with the advent of digital recording and digital mastering and this sort of thing, we started to see the loudness wars happening. Actually, the loudness wars happened before that. Even in the 80s, when things were on radio, if one song sounded a little bit louder than the other one, then people tended to prick up their ears a little bit, pay a little bit more attention. This is also how advertising works on TV, for example. Although we have hard limits now as to how much higher adverts can raise their volume levels, back in the day those limits weren't there. So adverts would be unnecessarily loud to catch listeners' attention. So the same thing happened on radio. So you got this competition between different people trying to make their tracks louder than the next guy. And unfortunately with digital, a lot of the analog restrictions on this were removed, so you got stuff getting louder and louder and louder. And unfortunately, as things get louder, they don't necessarily get better. In fact, most of the time they get a lot worse. So if you take something like the Doom 2016 soundtrack, and you take the digital version and then the audiophile version, which is ripped from the record, and compare the two, when you match them subjectively in terms of volume, i.e. turn it down a little bit for the digital version, you'll find that the record version has a lot more dynamics, it's a lot easier to listen to, and it's just better sounding overall. Now, with the advent of streaming services, the whole loudness wars thing is largely completely irrelevant, because all of the major streaming services have some sort of gain matching functionality built into them. And what that means is that by default, these services will take your track, they analyze it on the server, and they basically set everything up so that everything that you listen to has roughly the same average amount of loudness or volume. So there isn't actually any reason, psychologically or otherwise, to brickwall your stuff anymore, or to make it unnecessarily loud, unless you happen to be catering for a specific platform which, for some reason, doesn't have gain matching. but those are few and far between. Now, for some styles of music, obviously a little louder can sound better. It's a subjective thing, but I have to admit with my own stuff, when I've mixed stuff that's in the heavy category, often it sounds better when it's that little bit louder and that little bit more brutal. But I would say there's pretty strong limits to that. Once you get into something like, listening to Meshuggah tracks, where they're really, really harsh in terms of their limiting and whatnot, I can listen to about 1.5 Meshuggah tracks before my ears just go, nah. I really like the music, but, and the older you get, the more that kicks in. So young people generally have a higher tolerance for being slammed in the head with really hard brick wall limited stuff because they just have more energy in general. But the older you get, the less energy you have, and the more that stuff tends to wear you out. There's been a lot of stuff written about this, so I don't need to go into it in massive amounts of detail. But there is an age factor there, which may explain to a certain extent why a lot of older people will tend to gravitate towards softer styles of music, such as classical and that sort of thing. But that's speculation on my part. That's nothing rational. But at any rate, what does that mean for you, the end mixer / mastering engineer? And let's face it, 90% of people nowadays are not going to send their stuff off to somebody to get mastered. They're going to do it by themselves in their bedroom. So, what does that mean for you? Well, from my personal perspective, you should ignore loudness. Just 100% ignore it. Look for what sounds best for that particular track, for that particular thing, and if it happens to sound better loud, great. But if it only sounds better loud because you haven't volume matched to see whether it sounds better when you've actually turned the volume down slightly on the slightly louder version, then you're just fooling yourself. Now there's a lot of plugins which will do what is called A-weighted volume comparisons. I think Steve Slate's FGX does that, and there's a few EQ plugins that do that as well, which is really useful for EQing. So basically what that means is it takes the subjective human frequency response, so how loudly we hear certain frequencies, it applies that to the incoming signal and to the outgoing signal, and then it tries to subjectively volume match the incoming and the outgoing. So what that means is when you have that turned on with something like FGX and you start cranking up the volume, what you actually hear is the change that is making to the overall sound, not just the increased loudness, the increased volume. The increased volume doesn't help you in terms of how good the thing sounds. Now, as I said, with streaming services nowadays and volume matching, you don't have to worry about competing with other people's tracks in terms of loudness, and anybody who tells you that you do is just not clued on to what is really going on nowadays. Even on stuff like the radio, back in the day, like the 90s, we're talking pre-digital radio, every station ran all of their stuff through a bunch of compressors and whatnot before spitting it out onto the air. So, in effect, if you had a really heavily loudness maximized track and you gave it to them, it would actually end up sounding less loud than a more gently mastered track on radio, simply because the more gently mastered one was still retaining its transients and dynamics and stuff. It was sounding more punchy under the station's own compression. So the loudness war, in a sense, has been a completely futile pursuit for a very long time, and my advice is just ignore it. So with all that stuff out of the way, let's get on to the actual topic of loudness. So volume is another part of your music. It's another variance in tone, like timbre, like pitch. So if you constrain it too much, then you end up with tracks, or even within the same track, you end up with not a lot of change and not a lot of variation. And that ultimately damages the quality of your music. And it can certainly damage the quality of an album if you have no variance between the tracks in terms of volume or dynamics, then everything starts to sound even more the same. You can hear this far more forcefully in some forms of music than others. For example, in pop and modern R&B and stuff, there's often a lot of space in the tracks sonically. So you have the beats, you have the vocals, and then you have chord stings or whatever. But there tends to be a lot less going on in the various different frequency ranges compared to something like rock or metal. When you get to rock or metal, almost every instrument tends to have a fairly wide spectrum of frequencies, which makes it very hard to mix. And that also means that when it comes to mastering, if you heavily master a rock mix or a metal mix, you end up with something that sounds far less dynamic and far more scrunched, and far less interesting to listen to overall than if it were a pop mix or an R&B mix or even a rap mix. Because in rap there tends to be a lot of gaps, right? So you might think, oh, rock and metal, I want to make them super loud. I would kind of advise against that. You want to make them sound super good, and super good may not be loud. If you go back to the 90s, showing my age, if you look at something like Rage Against the Machine, their first couple of albums, they had very strict quality standards around what they were doing. They retained as much of their dynamics as possible. And that didn't stop them from becoming one of the biggest, most well-known, metal groups in the entire world. So don't think that by, focusing on quality and getting something really good, you're going to be limiting yourself there. By comparison, when I look at something like Rammstein, put out some very good sounding albums in the late 90s and early 2000s, and then progressively got worse and worse as their stuff got more and more brick wall limited, until at this point I wouldn't even bother listening to their stuff, to be honest. So, loudness, volume is definitely something that you want to preserve. It's an integral part of music. It's an integral part of emotional dynamics. That's why if you have something with a, quiet verse, loud chorus, quiet verse, that tends to have more of an impact. That's famously what Nirvana did a lot of. Of course, a lot of people before that did that as well, going all the way back to classical times. But, volume has an effect on you emotionally, for the reasons I stated earlier. So if you're jumping to the chorus and you've still got your brick wall limiter set at the same level and the incoming signal pumps up, you can often end up with tracks where subjectively it actually ends up sounding quieter in the chorus. And I've heard this on a lot of dubstep stuff, particularly on places that are have a lot more amateur content like Submit Hub. Dubstep stuff, holy man, most of the time they seem to be just scraping out any dynamic range, and the result of that is you have this build up and then the drop sounds somehow a lot quieter, and it certainly has no impact on the listener emotionally. So, don't do that if you want to make high quality music. Sorry. Now, best way to achieve louder tracks, if that is something that you are aiming for, is not in the master, it's in the mix. You need to have your individual tracks within that song have a high level of EQ separation, because when you apply compression, when you apply limiting, for most compressors, most limiters, what it's doing is it's looking at the entire spectrum of what's coming in, and anything that is loud beyond a certain level of decibels will start to clamp down on it and make it less loud, and then it applies some gain afterwards to push the rest of it up. What that means is that the strongest frequencies get quieter and the weakest frequencies in that particular track get louder. So if you're applying compression, then by necessity you need to have much more EQ separation between your tracks. That's why it's much easier to mix, say, acoustic stuff than it is to mix metal, because for acoustic stuff, generally speaking, you don't want a highly compressed sound, so you don't have to do a heck of a lot of EQ separation, and it would probably sound a little bit unnatural if you did, right? So, best way to achieve loudness is in the mix. I've heard other tips around this, such as, for the individual tracks, being very careful with your transients, making sure, for those of you who are a bit more novice, transients are little bits of audio that just go whoop, whoop, go up and down very quickly. The example would be the attack on a kick drum, that sort of thing. You don't really want to get rid of your transients, because a lot of the time they are what really brings the impact to a mix, right? If you don't get the transient on a snare or a kick, then the snare or the kick is just going to kind of sound thumpy without any crack or really any dynamic in it. So you can certainly trim off your transients and prevent the really outlier peaks from getting in the way of things before things go into your compressor. But I wouldn't do it too much. Dynamics are there for a reason. So bearing that in mind, once you get to mastering, and once you've actually done a decent mix and everything's nicely separated again, then again you're probably going to have some kind of mastering EQ, mastering compressor, and mastering limiter. And the same things apply again. If you don't have that good EQ separation between your tracks, then applying that compression, applying that limiting, is going to make your mix sound more muddy and make the instruments sound more less separate, rather. So basically what I'm saying is, if you want a loud mix, EQ separate, right? Having said that, the real purpose in compression and in limiting, from my point of view, is not to make things loud, it's to make things sound better. With compression in particular, you can make a track that just doesn't quite have that oomph, just get a real kind of muscle or a tone to it that you wouldn't get otherwise, that you wouldn't get from straight EQing. Multi-band compressors are particularly good, particularly for mastering, because they allow you to take different frequency spectrums and compress them separately. I quite like Isotope Ozone for this, although there are others that probably do a better job. But there are other things you can do as well. You can do what's called upward compression, so instead of taking the signal coming in and then clamping it down above a certain amount, you can take the signal coming in and bump it up above a certain amount, right? So there's different ways to compress, but generally speaking what we're doing is downward compression. And there's all sorts of factors to that. There are probably better videos out there for understanding the fundamentals of compression, so I would probably suggest you go out there and look at that. But as a brief overview, you've got your attack, that is how fast the compressor kicks in once the volume goes over a certain level. You've got the release, which is how fast the compressor tails off after it goes below a certain level. You don't want your attack being too fast on a lot of instruments like drums, because then it cuts off those transients, those nice little attacks and stuff that we're talking about. On some instruments you do want to do that. So learning about what are the different recommendations for different attacks and release for different instruments is a good way to start. You've got the ratio, which is the amount that it's actually dropping the volume level on those higher volume areas. And then depending on what compressor you've got, you may have a bunch of different options, such as low-pass filtering. Low-pass filtering can be particularly useful for compression, because some of those low frequencies can be quite loud, but nowhere near as audible as the higher frequencies, so they can kind of trigger the compressor to an extent that is not useful. But ultimately you need to go with your ears and just hear what sounds best. Limiters are, for all intents and purposes, for the most part, are essentially just a more brick wall version of a compressor, really. They take the information above a certain volume level and they really clamp it down quite flat. That's simplifying it. There are obviously a lot of different types of limiters and they do different things, but that's more or less the basics of it. Limiters I find are more useful in terms of actual audio quality rather than making things sound louder, in terms of building up layers in a mix. So you can have sort of a mix where everything's sort of at a certain level, but things are sort of jumping out at certain points and kind of going down again. Limiting as opposed to compression, at least in terms of the subjective feeling that I get from it, tends to turn the individual tracks in a song into more or less kind of layers. They sort of don't go above a certain level in terms of volume. And those layers can be used to structure a mix and separate things a little bit, which can be quite useful. But I don't like, personally, using limiters too much, because I find that they tend to, again, sort of flatten a mix out a bit, and if you use them too much, you just end up with a mix that kind of sounds like, just a little bit like cardboard, subjectively speaking. When it comes to mastering limiting, that's a whole nother field, because mastering limiters they have a lot more responsibility. They're responsible for the whole track, the whole song, sorry. And over the past 10-20 years, there's been some really strong research and development gone into mastering limiters, and there are some really fantastic ones now. One I like is called Limiter Z. They have a free version of it, but that one does an incredibly good job at not just, making stuff sound louder, but actually improving the overall subjective feel and tone of what you've got coming in. I've recently gone back over a bunch of my older tracks and with that one, Limiter Z, and just to see how much they could actually be improved, not in terms of increasing the volume, but just in terms of the overall subjective sound quality of the mix, and it's quite striking. So if you're going to be doing your own mastering, I would certainly go out and compare a bunch of different limiters, find the ones that work for you on different types of music, etc. So on the other end of the scale, you have things like gating and expansion. Gating is basically if the volume for a certain track is not above a certain level, then just drop it down to 0 dB, or negative infinity rather, if we're talking on the digital scale. That can be quite useful for certain areas. It can be useful for noise processing, getting rid of unwanted noise, particularly useful if you are compressing stuff and you know that you do have noise, to gate the noise out before it starts going to the compressor and whatnot. But it can also be useful just aesthetically in terms of making a track sound nicer. And expanders do the opposite of compressors. They take a track which you find is too compressed, has not enough dynamic range, and they just expand the dynamic range. Both of those things tend to have attacks and releases, so the same kind of things apply to them as apply to compressors. Now, another note which is just on mastering this time, and it's not really related solely to loudness, but one of the things that you can do if you're not that good, if you're a novice or whatever, with mastering, is to use mastering, or demoed mastering, let's say, to improve your mixing. What I mean by that is sometimes you can do a lot of stuff in mastering which could be done much better in the mix instead. So if you take your mastering plugin, put it in there, or plugins, put them in there, start adjusting stuff, and you find, oh, that sounds better, that sounds better, that sounds better. Often you'll find that it sounds better on this instrument, but not on this instrument. What that means is you haven't EQ'd or compressed or whatever that particular instrument properly in the mix. So then you need to go back to the mix and go, okay, I'll adjust that here. And sometimes you're bumping stuff up overall on the EQ level in the master, and that should make you realize that, oh, I don't have enough of that particular frequency range, or I have too much of that frequency range in the mix. Where is that coming from? What instrument? What can I adjust? If you adjust it in the mix first, you'll inevitably almost always get a better master. Now the same thing applies for loudness, compression, and limiting. So if you're applying compression at the mastering stage and you're going, oh, that sounds much better, maybe you want to go back to the mix and just look at the individual group buses and go, okay, maybe I should be compressing these buses individually better, because inevitably you're going to be able to do a much more customized job on those individual buses than you are on the overall mix. And lastly, with limiting, of course, we've talked about mastering limiting, and it is a thing in its own right which can bring the song as a whole together more and make it feel like a much more cohesive and hard-hitting song or whatever. But again, you know, if you're using too much compression and too much limiting on your master, maybe you want to go back to the individual tracks and just see what you can adjust there to make things sound better on that volume level. But to return to my earlier point, I think using compression and limiting just to create maximum loudness is a lost war. You've already lost. You know, there are other people out there who can make their tracks much louder than you can, and you're not in any competition with them, and you probably never will be. So with the advent of streaming services that can volume match and whatnot, you might as well just make your track sound the best it can, regardless of compression, regardless of loudness, and then just see what happens. If you ever get to the point where you get signed on a label or anything like that, which is, to be honest, probably not going to happen for 99.999999999 recurring % of people, then at that point, you know, maybe you ship it off to a proper mastering agent or, you know, that sort of thing. And maybe the record company has some particular opinions on how loud they want things to be. There's a limit to that, of course. I mean, if you've got a track that's just incredibly quiet, particularly for the genre, like if you've got a metal track and it just has no body in the mix or whatever, then obviously you want to do something with that. But in general, focus on the quality of the music and the quality of the volume, not the quantity. So you may have noticed that people like to share, people like to like, and people like to subscribe. Would you like to share, like, or subscribe? Feel free to do any of those things at any given point in time. Or don't.